From the great halls of their house, there are assembled three who hope to one day be the world's greatest driving heroes. Created from the cosmic legends of the universe comes our team captain, the Vision, Bill Fisher. Their soon-to-be Wonder Woman, Vicki Fisher. Our Captain Marvel and head flight trainee, Jennifer Skripchuk. And our Batman, the master of tools, gadgets, and all things mechanical, our mild-mannered soon-to-be billionaire, Alan Danvers. Their mission, to fight injustice, share what is right and wrong, to get you out of your house and come out racing with them, and serve all mankind. They are the Garage Heroes in Training Team.
Welcome to the Garage Heroes in Training podcast. I'm going to be one of the hosts for this episode, and my name is Bill. Who else is hosting?
I'm Vicki.
You are. Your microphone's back.
It is.
You don't sound like you're in a paper towel roll anymore. It's awesome.
This is true.
The hazards of being in a move. Anyway, the box was open. The microphone was found. We have a returning guest who is going to help us solve something we've been trying to work on since we started. And hopefully he tolerates our incompetency, but he is the owner of Fast Sideways. He is a future instructor to the Garage Heroes in Training Team. And we need that. And he just started sim coaching and consulting on the setups. So welcome back to the podcast, Nick Romano.
Thank you very much, Bill and Vicki. And you're making me self-conscious with your handheld microphones. I feel like I should get in on that game. Can you hear me now? How's this?
Yes.
It's gone very bassy now. Very nice.
I do have some bad news, by the way. We're not going to solve your problem today.
Oh, I know. You have no idea how much problem we have. This is going to be part one of many. And
one of the issues with suspension is that the more you learn about it, the more you realize you have absolutely no idea what you're doing. And it's going to take years and years of testing that is mostly impractical and will never really be complete.
So here I'm going to give you the foundation for what you're about to have to deal with for the next hour or so. Vicki and I came at this from we don't know how to drive. We need to learn how to drive. And we treat the car as a black box. So we get into the black box, we drive it around, we get out of the black box and try to figure out what we did wrong. The black box has never been anything that we have worked on.
Never thought about the black box being part of the problem.
It could help us in any way whatsoever. It's kind of, we get in, we drive it, we get out, and we say, okay, we need to do this. But then we started looking at the suspension and looking at alignments and looking at, I got spreadsheets. I got so much stuff and I don't know what to do with any of it. So you're dealing with people who want to know a lot, but know very little. So someday we'll be able to do these things.
I guess I kind of spoiled the topic, didn't I?
No, it's fine. It's fine. We're going to get there. We are going to get there. But first, in case people missed our first episode with you, besides Fast Sideways, which is fantastic and hopefully making its East Coast debut soon, if we have anything we can do to help, let us know. What do people need to know about Nick Romano?
So I can give you the quick synopsis of who I am and what I do. So I am a racer. Have raced in a lot of different stuff since I was a kid. And I have decided I've made a terrible life decision to make my career in motorsports. And what I ended up doing a number of years ago is I started the Fast Sideways Car Control Clinic, and that has become my main career path. So I teach car control as it relates to getting faster. So it's not a drift school, but there is some fundamentals of drifting involved. So basically I'm a coach. I teach car control. I do private coaching. I do sim coaching. I do video review. And I try to organize more people to the Fast Sideways way, and teach them about how learning how to control tire slip can improve you as a driver, make you faster, safer, more consistent, quicker to learn cars, quicker to learn tracks, etc.
I remember how Vicki has progressed. And in the beginning, she used to always compliment herself on how the car was like it's on rails and would just whoosh around the turn. And then she realized they're supposed to slide a little bit. And then everything got really fast. So
really fast until it goes really, really backwards.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you're not sure what to do
yes.
from that point.
Yeah.
The on rails thing is so funny. It's anytime you, now that you two know this, anytime you see somebody write, "Oh, that car was on rails," it's kind of a little hint that that person probably doesn't know what they're talking about.
Not so much. Not so much. All right, so this is going to be one that we're going to just bear with us, people. We don't know what we're going to ask, and we don't know what door we're going to open. We could ask the simplest little question, and Nick's going to be like 2 hours later still going into the introduction to the topic. So
that is my biggest fear for today.
It's okay. So should we start with weight control or suspension design? Because eventually we got to get to the tires, because unless your cars are maintained like some of ours have been, the only thing touching the ground is the tires. We have made notable exceptions at some times, but not on purpose. What are you thinking? What door should we open first? Behind door number 3.
Well, I think first we have to talk about why we do anything with suspension in the first place.
Nick, why did we do this?
Yeah, why do we do this to ourselves?
What did we do wrong in a prior life, Nick? What are we paying, like, something for we did, like, when
we
were
must
ancient?
be. Yeah, we must be. But yeah, so let's talk about why we even mess with suspension in the first place, especially like with a modern car. There's a lot of really good suspension in a factory sports car. Like, hilariously, GM has some of the best factory suspension out there right now with their Magna Ride stuff. So what's the purpose of changing these components? And you can sum it all up in a couple of ways. A race car or a track car needs to have really good grip so that you can corner faster. You need to be able to put that grip where it needs to be most effective. And that can happen statically, which means when the car is not moving, and also dynamically, which is while you're going into a turn, transferring weight with the brakes, the gas, the steering, etc. And the car needs to be easy to drive. If there's a car that's really, really fast, but is incredibly difficult to drive, you're probably not going to be able to get the most out of it. And so it's going to be a combination of those things. And it all depends on so many different factors. And this rabbit hole goes really deep. So it depends on what kind of tires you're on. It depends on what kind of surface you're on, how much grip that surface has, how smooth the surface is. Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it pavement? Is it dirt? Is it gravel?
Is it Mid-Ohio in the rain?
Is it Mid-Ohio in the rain, which we talked about last time? Exactly. And all these different factors, including driver preference, are going to play into what constitutes a well set up car. So there are, oh my gosh, so many components. There's springs, shocks, sway bars, tires, alignment, weights. There is dimension shocks, because shocks is like 4 different things all in one. There's the travel, there's the compression, there's the rebound, and then you can break those down into low speed, mid speed, high speed. There's the shape of the curve. Is it linear? Is it progressive? Is it digressive? Is it regressive? So there's just such an incredibly huge number of knobs you can turn, is one way to put it. So to get a handle on all that, you have to know what your goal is. You have to know what you're trying to get this car to do. And so throwing some coilovers on your car because you read about it online, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. It all depends on the other components of the car and what you're trying to do with that car. So whenever you're setting up a car, the first thing you should do is figure out, okay, what am I doing? Am I doing dual duty track day street car? Is this a dedicated race car? Is this a rally car? Is it a hill climb car? Is it a drift car? That's the first place you have to start. And then from there, you have to determine, what is my suspension design? And that's the factory design that it came with, like whether it be a McPherson strut, which I know you mentioned before, or is it a dual arm, or is it a multi-link? And I'll get into what all those different things are and what that means and how to deal with them differently. And then where's the weight in your car? Is this an MR2 with the weight in the back? Is it a Mustang with the weight in the front? What wheels are being driven? What kind of differential does it have? And then to round all that out, you've got your alignment. So where to begin?
I say we pick a car.
That's a good idea. Let's pick a car.
And an application.
And an application, yes. So hit me with your best shot. What do you got?
Well, I think most of our listeners are middle performance track drivers. We've got a good number of autocrossers. We've got a few that rally, like the real rally, not the rally that Vicki likes so much, but the real rally. And we've got a few ice racers, but I think most of our people would be track cars, medium to low performance, kind of grassroots racer. BMW E36, E46 kind of towards the top, maybe a Boxster Cayman, down to $500 Miata.
Yeah, let's start with the E36. That's a perfect one because that's what I've been racing this year or last year, and will be racing this year as well. So I've got a lot of really fresh information on that car.
That's
so
E36.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a 93 to 99, I want to say. BMW 3 Series, two-door, four-door. M3 had the S52 engine, so it's a naturally aspirated aluminum and iron, I believe, mix. Inline six, up front, rear-wheel drive, 5-speed manual transmission. Pretty simple car. It's a strut in the front, and it's a semi-trailing arm in the back. So what does that even mean? So we can gain some good information, some insight on what this car is going to need with all that information. So first of all, front engine rear-wheel drive, it's going to be front heavy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean by a lot. It's about 52 to 54% front weight.
Why is that
matter? Yeah, exactly. Okay. That matters because weight has inertia. It is more difficult to change the direction of a heavier object than a lighter object. So if you have a car that is 54% front weight, trying to change the direction of the front end by turning the wheel is going to be more challenging than a car with a 50% front weight, like an S2000, for instance. There is just physically less mass to try to change the weight of, change the direction of. So one difficulty is there's just more mass. The other difficulty is there's not a perfect balance of mass. So let's say you have a 255 width tire. If that 250 front and rear, if that 255 width tire has to deal with, let's call it 1,200 pounds in the front and 1,000 pounds in the back, that's a pretty light car. Maybe this is a Miata we're talking about. Let's just go with it. Then that same amount of rubber has more work to do and will therefore give up sooner on the front. So if this is a front engine rear wheel drive car, there's a common thought process that you want to have a wider rear tire. And maybe if you're drag racing, that's true. But if you are just going through a corner and all else the same, you've got more weight in the front than the back, you'd actually want more tire in the front to deal with that extra weight, all else being equal, which it never is. But just it's good to think about it in that way, because you almost never want to have a larger rear tire unless you have more rear weight. And you'll see that in 911s or some other mid-engine performance cars. So anyway, so the weight balance, that's the first thing to be aware of. Now the suspension design, the McPherson strut in the front and the trailing arm in the back. So the McPherson strut is the simplest type of front suspension. It has one lower arm, and rather than having an upper arm, it has this unit called a strut, which houses the shock and also the spring. And it is the member that the weight and the force of the tire grip travels through to the chassis. So if you have a dual arm car, that force goes through the arm. And if you have a strut car, that force goes through the strut. The benefits of a strut are that it's simple, light, and compact. The drawback is that it has worse geometry. And now we start to go down the rabbit hole. So what does that mean exactly? That means as the suspension travels through its range of motion, the wheel and tire need to, or hopefully do, tilt in such a way that it makes the contact patch stay flat against the ground. So in an ideal world, as the car leans over into a corner and the suspension compresses, the wheel tilts towards the center of the car, towards negative camber, to compensate for the body roll of the car and the squish of the tire. So that even as the car is fully loaded in a turn, you have a perfectly flat contact patch. So that's ideal. A McPherson strut, at best, goes straight up and down. So we'll never really have what's called camber gain. Camber gain is when that tire leans further towards the center as the car rolls over in the middle of a turn. So at best, the McPherson strut moves straight up and down. At worst, it actually has camber loss, which means it goes towards positive camber, thereby making your body roll situation even worse. The body roll is going to try to lean the tire onto the outside edge and not really use the full surface of the tire. Not whereas, but now that you have camber loss, as the car leans over and the suspension compresses, the tire leans even further away, and now you're basically cornering on the sidewall. So that's no good.
No.
So in a strut car that is well set up, and you can set up a strut car well, and by the way, a McPherson strut is not the end of the world. Every M3 ever made has a McPherson strut. Every 911, including the GT3 ever made, with the only exception of the latest 992 GT3, has a McPherson strut. So you can make a strut handle exceptionally well. You just have to know what it is you're dealing with, and therefore know how to tune to those constraints.
Okay.
You with me so far?
I think I am. I don't. Vicky's kind of lost in the woods a little bit.
It's fine.
So,
it's fine. My knowledge is not there yet.
So let's pretend that I'm doing hand signals for those not listening. I mean, not watching at home. So if you've got your tires straight up, you've got 0 degrees of camber, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you set the tire for negative camber, which means the top's tilted in and the bottom's tilted out.
Yep.
When you get it aligned, typically for a race shop kind of race alignment. And you're saying that during the turn, as your car's loading up, that a McPherson is either going to stay there or get worse, right?
Correct. Well, there's two things going on. So first of all, any car, no matter what the suspension design is, as you go into a turn, you have body roll. Some cars are more than others.
Sure.
But as the body rolls, the wheels are attached to the body.
Mm-hmm.
So even if there was no suspension movement whatsoever, even if there was no camber gain or loss whatsoever, as the body rolls, the wheel is going to be more towards the positive camber side of things just because it's following the body of the car.
Mm-hmm.
So that's unavoidable.
Right.
There will always be body roll, and that's always going to be the case. But yes, so in a McPherson strut, if it's not set up very well, as the suspension compresses, in addition to the body roll, the geometry of that suspension design is going to lean the tire even further out towards positive camber. I wish I could draw this.
Okay, so if it was at 3 degrees when you got your alignment set up, which we probably have to eventually talk about that, but that's okay. And then you start to turn, it's going to be less than 3 because you've shifted, you've rolled, and then right.
Correct. So let's say you've got 3 degrees of static camber. That means the car is just sitting there in the parking lot. You've got 3 degrees of negative camber. As the car leans, let's say it leans 2 degrees. Now you've only got 1 degree of negative camber, just from the body roll alone.
Right. And then the McPherson strut keeps it there or makes it worse.
Exactly. You might go down to 0, and 0 is never good because the tire has some deflection. So you're always going to want a little bit of negative camber to counteract that tire deflection.
So you would get the rim outside the tread.
Yes.
That would roll the tire off the tread.
Yes. Anybody who's seen a photo of a car's front wheel in the middle of a corner has probably seen this. It looks like the tire's almost getting pulled off the wheel. It almost looks dangerous. Yeah. But that's normal. That's just how they behave. So yes, you want to have some amount of camber to counteract that tire deflection so that while you're in the middle of that turn, you've got as much contact patch touching the ground as possible, not just the outside edge.
Okay.
So if our 3 degrees ended up at 0 degrees in the middle of a turn, then the obvious solution is add another degree. And now you've got 4 degrees of negative camber. You lose 2 of them from body roll. You lose 1 more from your McPherson strut, but you still have -1 degree of negative camber in the middle of your turn.
That's why when looking at the back of a Mini, the rear tires are at such an angle. They look like they're way more cambered than they really are, but they just look like it.
You said on the back of the Mini, huh?
Yeah.
So that, I don't know what the suspension design is on the back of a BMW Mini.
We should. We have 3 of them.
Is it a multi-link?
I don't think so. I'll find out while we're on.
Yeah. Well, so it could be that for whatever reason, the design of the rear suspension in that car does not have very much camber gain. So just like we described just now, you have to add a bunch of static camber to counteract the lack of camber gain in the suspension.
Okay. And that helps you in turns by putting more of the tire in contact with the ground, or keeping it more planar to the ground, so you have more.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. Okay. So the rabbit hole has already begun.
Oh, wow.
What were we talking about again? BMW
What?
36. Okay. So we've got our strut suspension. So, but we've already figured some stuff out before we've even touched the car. We figured out, okay, we know it's got struts in the front and we know it's front heavy. So we're probably going to be having to add a whole bunch of front camber to counteract this compromised suspension design. And why does it have a compromised suspension design? Why even have a McPherson strut in the first place?
Because it's cheap.
It's cheap, exactly. Yeah.
And McPherson wants to make his money.
He does.
Whoever
Although
that guy is.
I just read his name the other day. Somebody released an article about struts. I don't remember.
He's pretty old.
I think you're right.
Or he stopped aging. I'm not sure.
It's possible. It's always possible.
Yeah. Eventually we all do.
So anyway, most cars have struts. But if you know the constraints of a strut, you can make some guesses, some educated guesses as to what this car is going to need. And I'm going to say, just pulling a number out, if I had never played with an E36 before in my life, I'd say let's start at negative 3.5 degrees of camber, just because I know it's going to need a lot. And then you can test it and you can say that was enough, that was too much, that was not enough, and go from there. But at least you've got a baseline. For a strut car, 3.5, that's probably a good starting point.
And by testing it, you mean taking it on track and getting tire temps and things like that?
Yes, and I'm going to talk about that soon too.
Okay. There's lots of holes for us to dig, so
there are, yes. Okay, so we've made some guesses about this car. We know it's struts in the front. We know it's front heavy. We know it's rear wheel drive, and we know that we are building this car to be a track car with maybe some street duty. Is that about right?
Let's do full track car.
Full track car. Okay, well that actually makes things easier, less of a compromise.
I know. That's why
you did that on purpose.
I know a little bit.
Less of a compromise.
I know
so
that.
We don't need to worry about the comfort of the car. So we can make the car stiffer. Well, based on what we've already talked about, that's already a really good thing, because we know that body roll is a big part of our problem with keeping that tire in contact with the ground. So if we can stiffen the car up and reduce body roll, because we don't care about how comfortable the car is, then we can reduce the body roll and reduce the amount of camber loss we have just from the body roll alone, not even taking into consideration the suspension design.
Now, I know I've tried to learn this stuff and I've failed masterfully. Body roll is not equivalent to weight transfer, because the weight is going to transfer anyway.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If you had no springs in the car, the weight would still transfer, and you can prove that by driving a go-kart. Go-karts don't have any suspension unless you count the deflection of the tire, but you still feel your weight being transferred. Your body is being pushed to the outside, and you have to counteract that.
Right.
And a go-kart can pick up the inside front tire off the ground, so weight is still being transferred. So the body roll of the car is, how to put this? The rate at which the weight transfers is related to the stiffness of the car. So if you stiffen it up, the weight will transfer quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the body, see, that's not entirely true either.
So the best way I know to see this is if you we had an E36, we have E46s now.
Mm-hmm.
If you took that car that we have for the track to the track, you see it going around a turn, and you can see that it kind of turns a little less and a little quicker, whereas you took our ND new version Miata and you took that to the track when it was OEM style, and it would just kind of flop over a lot more, and it would take its time doing
right. So a soft car will have slower body roll. A stiff car will have quicker body roll, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the weight is transferring faster or slower. However, it does mean that the driver must transfer the weight faster or slower.
So on a slow transfer, you want to driver induce faster?
No, other way around. So the driver must match the inputs to the body roll rate.
Is
So
this
if
when
you
you hear
Okay.
the car needs to take a set kind of thing?
Yes, that's exactly correct. So if you're driving like a 14 passenger Econoline airport van, you're
That's
not going
not
to
a
be able to
track car.
turn. No, but if you if you ever went to Skip Barber, you have been in one on track. So if you're driving something like that, you cannot move the wheel very quickly because you would be trying to change direction before the weight has transferred onto the outside tires. So you want to match your inputs to the rate of transfer.
Okay. I'm
Which is
there.
why in Formula One they can move their hands very quickly because the weight
Mhm.
transfers and the body weight and the body roll transfers very quickly.
Okay.
So it's really a trial and error as you go for a while.
It is.
It's experience, I think.
It's experience. It's trial and error if you think of it from a standpoint of trying to pre-calculate how quickly you can move your hands on the wheel, etc.,
Right.
before you drive the car. And there are some drivers who do drive that way. It's not really trial and error if you do it more by feel, like what Bill was saying with just experience.
Mm-hmm.
The better you get, the more experience you get at doing this, the faster you'll be able to just drive to what the car wants. Because you'll feel if it's wrong. If you're in a really soft car and you wrench the wheel to the side really quickly, the car might bounce a couple times as it's trying to take a set. Well, then you went too quickly. Or if it's a really stiff, grippy car and you move your hands very slowly, the car might just be laughing at you because you're not exploiting all of the capabilities that it has.
Car's laughing at you.
Right. So that's like if a first timer gets into a Le Mans prototype car that has pre-warmed tires and is just ready to go, they'll never be able to exploit all of the grip and poise available from that car. They'll probably be underdriving in every conceivable way, including how quickly they change direction or ask the car to change direction.
Okay. So now we've got the McPherson strut and we've got the rear trailing arm. Did we talk about trailing arms yet?
We haven't talked about the trailing arm yet. So the trailing arm is also a pretty basic suspension design. It's pretty much out of favor now. I don't think BMW uses it anymore either. So it's also quite simple. It pretty much just goes up and down. So if I was going to take a stab at this and make an educated guess, I would say that the trailing arm, being that it also doesn't have much camber gain, is also going to need a fairly high amount of camber. So maybe not quite as much as the front. So let's say 3 degrees. Now, this is exactly what my guess was the first time we went out to test the Palomar Racing E36. And I was pretty close. I wasn't quite perfect. It ended up not needing that much, according to our tire temps. It only wanted about 2.5, 2.7.
Mhm.
So, but that's kind of the process. You take a guess at what you think the car is probably going to need based off of some good information, and then you adjust from there. So how did we know that it wanted, let's say, 3.7 in the front and 2.7 in the back, or 2.5 in the back? You
This
do
could
that.
be the only part of this podcast that I know the answer
Oh,
to.
here we go. Hit me.
So if you got uniform tire temperatures across the tire, your pressure and your camber settings were proper for that track at that time with that driver.
That's going to be a solid maybe.
Oh, I can keep
Good
going.
job, Bill. Good job.
If the center's too high and the edges are too low, you have too much air, right?
Yes.
Okay, I got a half now. Okay.
Yes.
And if it's left or outside hot, inside cool, then you've got too much camber.
If the outside is hot,
Yes, because you're
then
overworking the outside. So you got too much.
then that would be not enough camber.
Exactly.
it's
Not enough camber.
Just like you said, not enough camber.
Exactly. It was
'cause
the
it's
other
leaning
side of the
too
car I was
hard.
talking about.
Right.
Hmm.
So what Bill's talking about here is taking tire temperatures across the surface of the tire. So the process here is you go out and you run a couple of hot laps, you get the tires all the way up to temp, and then you come into the hot pits fast, really hot, so the tires don't have a chance to lose much temperature. And then ideally you're using a tire probe, not an infrared gun, but a tire probe to get 3 different temperatures across the face of the tire: the outside edge, the middle, and the inside edge. And those measurements can tell you two things. They can tell you if your camber setup is correct, and they can tell you if your tire pressure is correct. And every tire is going to want a slightly different pressure and camber. You could have the same exact car, throw some, let's say a Toyo RR slick tire on it, and it might say it wants more camber. And then you could take that same car without changing a single thing, throw some Hoosier slicks on it, and it might say you have too much camber, with all the same exact settings. And that's just because the Hoosier has a stiffer sidewall and doesn't need as much camber as the Toyo does. That's just one example.
Mm-hmm.
So as Bill was saying, if the inside is hotter than if the middle is hotter than the outside of the inside, that means you have too much pressure. The tire's ballooning out. If the middle is cooler than the inside and the outside, then you don't have enough pressure, because the stiff sidewalls are what are holding the face of the tire up against the ground and not really the center of the tire as much. If all three are even, then you have pretty good tire pressure, except there's a big asterisk there. That assumes you're going in a straight line.
True.
And that number would be zero camber. If you had zero camber, then you would have a perfectly even tire temp across the surface of the tire. However, we're not doing straight line racing, we're doing road racing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go through a turn, that's when you want the tire to be flat against the ground. So when you're going through a turn, you're going to build even heat inside, middle, and outside. However, in between those turns, you have pesky straightaways. And when you have negative camber and you're going down a straightaway, the tires are not flat against the ground, they're at an angle. So the inside edge is creating more friction and therefore more heat than the outside edge. So when you actually pull in to take your tire temps with your probe, you're actually going to see, in an ideal setup, hottest on the inside, coolest on the outside, and right in between in the middle. And you're looking for a gradient of about 15 to 20 degrees. And some people will disagree. They'll say maybe 30 degrees. It depends a little bit on the tire, maybe a little bit on the type of car, but it's going to be somewhere in that range, 15, 20 degrees, something like that.
We're multinational dynasty in the making, and we're huge in Ghana. We've been number one in Ghana. I'm not bragging, but apparently they love us. So are we talking Fahrenheit or are we talking centigrade?
I'm talking Fahrenheit.
Okay. All right.
I don't know what the numbers would be in centigrade.
Divide by 2 for our international friends.
Ah, there you go.
It's pretty close.
Close enough. Close enough for
very
something
close.
Like 15 to 20 degrees.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, so there you go. So that's how you get your tire temperatures, and that can tell you if your camber is good, and it can tell you if your pressure is good. However, the reason that this is so challenging is because all things relate to each other. If you go and make a spring change, for instance, or a sway bar change, because that's where people often start, is they'll put stiffer bars on their car. If you change nothing else on the car, including your alignment, reducing the amount of body roll is going to reduce how much camber the car wants, or I should say how much camber the tire wants.
Captain's log supplemental.
Miss Vicki.
Yes, sir.
You know what?
What?
I've been thinking about this Sentinel system.
Yeah. Tell me about the Sentinel system.
So what I was thinking was, we have the one car that's got the aim dash that's slowing us down. Because installing the aim dash is actually, it probably is easy, but it's quite hard the first time. We haven't figured that out yet. The Sentinel system is really easy to set up. So what I was thinking was, why don't we put it in the Lemons car, and we'll worry about the aim data information separately, and we'll kind of break it down into a project. Because then we'd have the motorsports video system that we really, really want, and we'd be able to stream it. We just won't have the data inside, but we have the data outside, so we can combine them later. But I think that's a really good solution.
So what does this Sentinel system do?
Well, if it had the aim data, it would have all the data on the screen, and you could see all their telemetry and everything live. But we'd be able to not only record it for viewing after the race, but we could actually watch our car during the race
Ooh, like on the monitor and everything?
on a monitor. If you were at home and I was at a track, or if you were at the track and I was at home, depends on who gets the little short straw, but we'd be able to watch each other.
It's something I've always wanted to do.
And you know what? If you're driving, you know what you can do on the Sentinel system?
What's that?
You can communicate to me with your hands, and I can't do a thing about it.
Even better.
So, if you need to give a wave or a Jersey wave, whatever you need, we could save it and see it on the screen. And then you can have up to 3 different cameras, and it'll have picture in picture. You'll have the basic main shot out the front window, and then 2 cameras where you put them wherever you want. One could be on the driver, or one could be on the rear view. It's kind of cool.
Then we can upload it onto YouTube.
We could bore millions of people on YouTube.
I love it.
All right. Very well. You know what the only downside I see about this?
What?
Your mom and my mom are going to be panic stricken the entire weekend watching this thing to see if everything's going well.
This is true.
We probably shouldn't tell them.
I like the idea of having a Sentinel.
Mm-hmm. Well, luckily we have maybe 2. Depends on how things go. We're going to try. All right. That sounds like a plan. That's the project. We got to get that ready for the next race.
Sounds great.
All right. Very well. Thank you, ma'am. Vicki's just sitting here waiting for some wrench to turn. She's almost got a sway bar now.
Yeah. It's all foreign to me.
Well, let's think about that for a moment here. So remember, our camber is a factor of the suspension geometry, but let's just say that that's fixed. We're not going to change our geometry, and very few people do. You got what you got. If it's a strut, it's a strut, and you're just going to try to set everything up to work as well as possible with that strut. So your geometry is not going to change. But what can change is the amount of body roll you have. And as we discussed earlier, more body roll, because the wheels are attached to the body. If the body is leaning over, the tire is also leaning over. So now it's up on an edge.
Mm-hmm.
So if you put bigger, stiffer sway bars in, the car is not going to lean as far. Well, that was the whole point of the sway bar. You're trying to reduce the body roll. So if the body doesn't roll as far, the wheel's not going to roll as far.
Okay.
So the car that has more body roll is going to need more negative camber to counteract that body roll. Whereas the car with less body roll, you don't need as much camber.
Okay.
That's why
it's simple, right?
Okay-ish.
That's why so we made a transition last year from a predominantly rear-wheel drive primary car to a front-wheel drive primary car. And the car that we were using had a huge rear sway bar. And we talked to some friends who know a lot about the chassis we were doing, and we were recommended for Vicki and Jen, especially making the transition, to make that sway bar lower so the car would be a little less tail happy, a little less oversteery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of related to, I was trying to get it back to something she was familiar with, what we did.
Yeah.
It's not helping, though.
That's a two-part of the go ahead, Vicki.
No, it's my knowledge base is not quite there at the moment to put all the pieces together. If that makes sense.
Well, of course.
It's getting there.
So part of the problem that it's so confusing is because we've been talking about tire contact patch and how that's related to the setup changes you make in the suspension. And then what Bill just brought up was dynamic balance of the car, which is not the tire contact patch, but is just as important. So the dynamic balance is what everybody talks about: understeer, oversteer, that sort of thing.
Right.
Which changes depending on your bar settings, your spring settings, your shock settings, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But it also changes with contact patch. So let's wrap up this in a nice package.
There's a lot of factors.
There is a lot of factors. So let's put a bow on this.
If it was easy, we could ask good questions.
Here's how this works. Tires. Tires are what matter here.
Right.
Tires are everything. There are constants within the car, like your suspension design, where the weight is. You're not going to change that. If you've got an M3, the weight's in the front, and it's going to be in the front. If you've got a 911, the weight's in the back and it's going to be in the back. If you've got a front wheel drive car, it's like 60+% front weight. And that's not going to change. That's just going to be the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
So your suspension design is constant. Your weight balance is constant mostly. And your tires, you can think of as a constant. Because although you can change your tires and put a different compound on, once they're on the car and you're on track, you got what you got. So you want to set your car up to work with those tires. So those are our constants, sort of.
Right.
So the first thing you want to do is increase the mechanical grip of the car as much as is physically possible. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the balance of the car.
Okay.
All that means is let's get as much grip out of all 4 tires as we possibly can. And that's the contact patch.
Okay.
Are you talking setup wise or driver wise or both?
That's setup.
Okay.
But it's nothing to do with springs or shocks or bars. It's got a little bit to do with those, but we'll get there. All this has to do with is when the car is in the middle of the turn, are you utilizing as much of the contact patch as possible? Right. That's number one. And a lot of people skip over this and try to change their shock settings and do all these other different things, but they haven't even figured out their contact patch yet. So let me give you an example of this. And a huge part of this comes down to your camber settings. So in my personal race car, my Lexus IS300, I was limited to about 2.7 degrees of front camber when I first put the car together. And that was just based off of the suspension arms that I had in the car. It was stock front arms. And this car, it's set up to be pretty good. It's got dual arms from the factory. So it's not a McPherson strut. So in theory, it's got really good geometry, good camber gain. So as the car leans over, the wheels tilt in to improve that contact patch. So in theory, it's really good and doesn't need as much camber. But the most I could get was 2.7. And I drove the car for a while and it was pretty good, won some races. And then my sponsor, Figs Engineering, who makes suspension components for Lexus cars specifically, sent me a set of his brand new upper control arms. And I put those in, and that let me get to 3.4 degrees, or maybe 3.6 degrees of negative camber. And I threw them on the car at that setting, and I went out to drive. And the change in the behavior of the car was staggering. Really? I went from a car that had an understeer bias, where I was having to drive around understeer. And with that one change, I didn't change my springs, my shocks, my bars, or anything else. All I did was increase the front camber. And now the car was an oversteer drift machine, whether I wanted it to be or not. And I didn't change the setup of my car. All I did was improve how much of the front tires I was actually using. So the grip was always there. It's the same tire, the same setup. The grip was always there. I just wasn't utilizing it because my contact patch was not as good as it could have been. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So was that a case of you increased the front grip and didn't address anything on the back, so your balance went out?
Yes, that's exactly correct. But there's an important distinction to be made here. I did not increase front grip at the expense of rear grip.
Right. It was a utilization.
Right. I increased grip, period. There's now more grip in the car, period, than there was prior to making this change. So that's an important distinction, because once you have your contact patch, quote unquote, perfect for all 4 tires, then your job becomes moving the grip around where it's going to be most effective, where it's most needed. So that's the dynamic balance, moving the grip where it's going to be needed. You have a fixed amount of grip, but you can still move it around.
Okay.
But what I did there was I just physically added more grip to the equation.
Okay.
So I think the biggest, I'm just trying to help Vicki get there, is the biggest change you would see is when we went from like normal street tires to our 200 treadwear racing tires.
Okay.
You just had more grip, so you could go mow faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Going to a softer compound is the same idea. You're adding more grip. And then you can take that new softer compound and fine tune your alignment and your suspension setup to utilize that tire better. But yes, you are just physically bolting more grip into the equation, which is the same as what I did. So this is the reason I call this the first step, is because if you have an imperfect contact patch, like I did with my 2.7 degrees, sure, I could change the setup in my car to compensate for that. But there was so much grip left that I wasn't utilizing yet. And it's so much better to add on that grip and get everything you're possibly going to get out of the tires, and then change the dynamic setup of the car. That's always the best path.
Right.
So I know in some like Spec Miata and some other series, you're only allowed certain changes. So your I might use their terms poorly, but the suspension geometry is limited. So you've got a limited window where you can adjust.
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying to maximize your capability within the geometry you have in your car? Or are you saying, if allowed, change the geometry?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So Spec Miata is a great example. I know a little bit about Spec Miata, so I can speak to what they actually do, or at least used to do in that series. So the Miata with stock components is limited to maybe 3 degrees. Well, it depends on your ride height. So here's where we get a little more tricky. If you take a Miata and you absolutely slam it to the ground, you can get a lot of camber. You're going to get a lot more rear camber than you are front camber. So it's probably not a good setup from that standpoint. But you can get a bunch of camber. You're also going to run into some other geometry issues involving your roll center. Now that is a can of worms, and I'm not sure if we should open yet.
If you say Ackerman angle, I'm out.
We don't have to talk about Ackerman.
Okay.
That's something that 99.9% of people are never going to mess with anyway. That's just fixed. It's built into the car, and you're never going to touch it.
That's when my eyes rolled up in my head like a great white shark.
But the roll center is pretty much built into the car as well. So you're not going to really change that usually, but except with your ride height. So cars are designed to be, these street cars are designed to be street cars. They're not designed with lowering in mind.
Right.
So they're designed to work at or close to their factory ride height. So when you start to lower them, some weird stuff can happen. And in the Miata's case, and many other cars' case, if you lower it beyond a certain point, you actually make the front suspension softer. So it's sort of counterintuitive, because it seems like when you lower the car, you're going to reduce the body roll because you have a lower center of gravity, which is true, but you're also going to increase the body roll because the leverage point of the chassis against the suspension becomes greater. So you have more body roll as a result of going too low.
Mm-hmm.
That would take a lot of drawings to explain. So I'm not going to go deeper
It's tough
into
on
that.
an audio podcast to
yeah,
have
exactly,
a lot of drawings.
But so I brought that up to say this. So what they ended up doing, because they weren't allowed to change the geometry at all, they were stuck in this point where they needed more camber, so they had to lower the car.
Mm-hmm.
But the more they lowered the car, the worse the geometry became, for the roll center reason, and also just because they ran out of travel on the shock when they hit the bump stop. So they had to choose what they found to be the best compromise between reasonably okay geometry and enough camber. So that's a perfect example of you're working within the limitations of your series. There is no perfect right answer. It's all a compromise. You're never going to have enough camber, and you're never going to have perfect geometry, and you're never going to have, there was a third one and I forgot what it was, but it's never going to be perfect is the point.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So you have to figure out what's going to be the best combination of compromises for your use case. And, I couldn't tell you what ride height they run or what camber they run. I've never actually raced in Spec Miata, but, obviously there's a lot of fast people in those series, and they've figured out what works best for them.
Yeah, I think they're limited for ride height last time I looked at the rule books, but it's all, read your rule books, people.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then it's in a series like Spec Miata, then you get into like, oh, well, if they measure from this point, what if I just tapped this point with a hammer a couple of times? And, it just happened because I hit a curve. I didn't do it on purpose.
Those damn candy stripes, they just keep messing with that height. I can't imagine what happened there.
Exactly. I've heard stories about people intentionally bending control arms too to try to change their alignments back, that sort of thing. Oh, yeah. Yeah, people do some weird stuff.
Oh.
It's racing. We do this.
Yep.
Okay, so should we get into ranking of the suspensions, or should we keep going with the E36? Sorry.
Okay, well, we can continue to use that E36 as an example. Let's say that in this car, we're not limited by our geometry, because with a nice camber plate and everything, and an E36, you can get enough camber. It's not really a problem. So we don't have the Miata issue. We're not limited by travel. We're not limited by camber. We can make it work. We can make the tire contact patch be great. We're utilizing all of the mechanical grip available to us from those tires. Now, the next job we have is to set up the suspension to utilize that grip as well as possible. Because like in my case in the Lexus, I found more grip, but that grip was in the front end. And then I had an imbalance. I had too much front grip and not enough rear grip. So then what I had to do was move that grip around. And you do that with springs and sway bars mostly. So the sway bars essentially are just a spring. So for the sake of conversation, let's just talk about springs for now. We can just throw away sway bars for the moment. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you press down on a spring, the spring pushes back. And that force generally is transmitted to the opposite diagonal corner of a car.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Missed that part.
So let's think about this dynamically. So you're driving your E36. You go into a corner, the car leans over. While it's leaning over, it's pushing down. Let's say it's a left turn, pushing down on the right front spring and the right rear spring. It's pushing down. Those springs are pushing back with an equal amount of force. So the right front spring, the force coming from that right front spring is going to go to the left rear wheel and tire. The force coming from the right rear spring is going to go to the left front wheel and tire. So let's say, like in my case, the car has an oversteer bias. The rear end is skittish. It's difficult to carry speed. It's difficult to put power down because it just wants to slide on you all the time. So how do we fix this? We want to add more grip to the rear end. Now, we can't just take more grip and add it in because we've got the tire we're going to have.
You just did.
Well, yeah, so we're done doing that.
I want to do that again.
Well, then buy Hoosiers.
Okay. Damn it. I was so close.
Well, the other secret is aerodynamics, but we'll get to that in a minute.
I don't want to do that. I mean, I do, but I don't. Okay.
It's kind of more fun without sometimes. I don't know. It all depends on your perspective. So we've got all the grip we're going to have, and now we just want to move it. We've got an oversteer condition in our car. We want to add more grip to the rear. So the best way to do that, well, there's two ways if we're talking about springs. We can add more spring rate to the front. So when that right front gets compressed, it pushes back with more force. And if it pushes back with more force, it's going to push that left rear harder into the ground.
Okay.
So now we've not added more grip, but we've moved the grip from the front to the back.
So we'd rather do that than a wider tire.
Maybe.
Okay.
Just throwing those questions in.
I'm just trying to get there.
Well, okay, so let's see.
Because I know when we had the E36, I believe, I know for the E46, they had staggered tire size front to rear. So I thought, and this is me trying to figure this out, that's why they did it, was to counteract rear oversteer by having more meat back there.
It could be, and that would work. However,
we never raced that way. We always raced a square setup with the equal size rear tires front and back.
Right. Yeah. And there are plenty of examples of race cars that have wider rear tires in front. There's also some examples of race cars that have wider front than rear. There are some front wheel drive race cars that do that. So that is a solution. But if you're allowed to have wider tires in your class, wouldn't you also want them up front?
That's kind of what I thought we did with the race car, because we just ended up using 4 rear tires instead of 2.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that goes back to step one, which is
Get the
add
most
as much mechanical grip as you possibly can. So if you're
Okay.
allowed to have a 275 instead of your 255, then put 275s everywhere.
Mhm.
Because in our step 2 now, even if there's too much grip in the front, we can move that grip where we need it.
Okay.
So yeah, so to answer your question, it would work, but it's not the best way.
Okay.
Unless you're driving a 911.
Yeah, because it's got all that weight back there.
Right. So if you have an imbalance in weight, because that's one of our fixed components that you're not going to change, then you want to put more tire where there is more weight. And if you follow that through on the E36, you'd end up with a larger front tire than you would rear.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody actually does that. Not in a front engine rear wheel drive car.
Yeah, they do it in our Civic. Is there's 2 setups, and one's got the front larger than the rear, and one's got equal. So
yeah, it makes sense in a front wheel drive car. And theoretically, maybe it makes sense in an FR car, but I've never seen anybody actually do that. And it kind of doesn't make that much sense, because you can just make the car behave with the square setup anyway. And then you just maximize your tire sizes for your class, front and rear.
because you're usually not going to have that big an offset anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's always better just to put as much tire as you're allowed and put it everywhere, unless there's a really good reason not to, like a 911.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So moving our grip around. So we had an understeering car. Our E36 was we had an oversteering E36. So we put a stiffer front spring on, because that's going to transfer more weight to the inside rear tire and push the rear harder into the ground. So we've moved the grip from the front to the back, and that has rebalanced our car, and now hopefully is neutral.
Okay. I've got questions, but I don't think you want them yet.
So, okay, well, sure. Let me just finish that thought. The other option is, instead of stiffening the front, you can soften the rear. And if you soften the rear, it will transfer more weight onto the rear. It will push less hard back to the front.
Okay.
So more weight and therefore more grip is on the back, less weight and therefore less grip is on the front. Now, we haven't taken grip away, we've just moved it from the front to the back. So a stiffer front spring or a softer rear spring is going to have the same net effect in rebalancing the car.
But there's a limit to both.
There is definitely a limit. And that limit comes in the form of bounce frequency. So an undamped spring. So if you just had a spring sitting there on your counter and you're in a spaceship, your counter is in a spaceship.
This is physics class, so I have my frictionless pulley and everything.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So you've got a spring sitting on your desk and you whack it. It's going to oscillate at a particular frequency. And it's going to do that forever. Well, not forever, because there's some internal friction, but it's going to do it for a really long time. So that frequency, that is the bounce frequency of the spring. And then when you put a spring in the car and you have your suspension geometry and all that kind of stuff, if you were to bounce the front end of the car and it goes up and down, up, let's say you've got blown shocks and it bounces up and down, that's the bounce frequency of the car.
Right.
There are ranges in which the bounce frequency of your car is happy. So a production-based race car is going to be happy within a particular range. A production-based race car with aerodynamics is going to be happy within a stiffer range of bounce frequency. And then as you go towards Formula One cars, that sort of thing, it's going to be even stiffer. The bounce frequency is going to get faster as you go more towards an aero heavy car. And if you look at a road car, they've got really low bounce frequencies. Think about an old Cadillac. I mean, that's real low. That might be less than a hertz of frequency. So yes, there are limits, and it's limited by a big part of it is the tire. If you go too stiff for a particular tire, it's going to skip across the ground and not really grip the ground. And then if we're thinking on the big picture scale, stiffer means less grip. Just Just gonna throw that one out there. And
We
Mhm.
did that. We did that once. We found that to be true.
what did you find?
The pavement was a little bumpy, and it was kind of jumping across from bump to bump, especially during braking zones.
Mm-hmm.
And overall, our grip seemed lower, so we turned the adjustable shocks down like a quarter of the range,
Mm-hmm.
and it
Yeah.
got better.
That makes perfect sense. Even if you're on a smooth surface, more stiff can also mean less grip. Now you were experiencing bumps, so that makes a ton of sense. Of course, you would need it to be compliant so that the
Mhm.
tire can maintain that contact with the ground over the bumps. But even if it's smooth, you don't necessarily want stiffer suspension just because stiff.
Right.
There's some math and science that goes into this that goes above my head. But the basic concept is a softer suspension will enable you to have more mechanical grip. And that's true up to a point. If it's too soft, then the car is going to be wallowy and difficult to control, and you might not ever be able to get your alignment correct because you've got so much body roll that even though you've maxed out your camber settings, it's still going up on the tires going up on an edge. So there's some constraints to that. A general way you can think about it is you want it to be as stiff as necessary, but as soft as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So as stiff as necessary to keep your contact patch happy and to make the car feel racy, like the driver can put the car where they want it. They can dice with other cars comfortably without feeling like they're driving a 70 Cadillac, but no stiffer than that, because then you run into the potential of losing some of that mechanical grip.
So most of our cars, and the cars I'm talking about are HPD cars and our race cars. Most of them have somewhat sporty suspensions, upgraded from OEM.
Mm-hmm.
And we were always trying to get to the lowest setting possible that we got because if we went higher, as we went too high, our time started going down.
Right. Now you're talking about shocks though, right?
Yes.
Aha. Now here's a very common misconception. I'm glad you brought that up. Shocks do not change the roll stiffness of the car. That is not their job.
It's got to be somebody's job here, man. Come on.
Let me put an asterisk there. Because they do affect it. Affect it. But it's the spring's job to adjust the roll stiffness.
But I don't want to change springs, man.
I know, it sucks. It's hard. And in some classes, like in autocross specifically, you're not allowed to. So shocks are all you've got. So then you use the shock to try to mimic the effect of a spring.
Okay.
So with compression specifically, so that's the shock's resistance to the wheel and tire compressing into the fender. So
shortening
the outside tire, the outside tire when you're rolling into a corner. The compression, if you put a whole bunch of specifically low speed compression into a shock, you're going to kind of mimic the effect of a stiffer spring. Now, it's not actually changing the roll stiffness of a car, because shocks and springs work in two extremely different ways. Springs increase their stiffness linearly as you compress them. So the further you compress them, the stiffer they are. Shocks do not care how far you compress them. Shocks create resistance based on the speed at which they're being compressed. So that means you could take a shock and very slowly compress it 3/4 of the way down its stroke, and it's not going to do anything different. And then once you get to 3/4, you could rapidly try to shove it the rest of the way in, the rest of the way in, and it's going to fight like hell. The spring, on the other hand, you can move as fast as you want or as slow as you want. And it's going to give you exactly the same results. It's going to be, let's say, 1,000 pounds of resistance per inch of travel. And if you do that inch of travel really quickly or really slowly, it's going to be 1,000 pounds either way. So the spring and the shock are kind of at odds with each other there. They don't do the same job. They're not meant to do the same job. So you could take the shocks out of the car and throw them away, and your bounce frequency and your roll stiffness asterisk will still be the same. And then when you put the shocks in, their job is not to change your roll stiffness. Their job is to manage the oscillations of the suspension. So when you go over those bumps, exactly like you described, Bill, your shocks were too stiff for that surface, and you were bouncing over the undulations of the road. So you softened them, and it allowed the suspension to compress and rebound faster. Now, that didn't change your roll stiffness because the spring is still the same. The spring is still the same rate that it was before. But the shock is allowing that motion to happen faster. So the tire can stay in better contact. So when the shock is too stiff, the wheel and tire cannot compress in the suspension quickly enough. So that force gets transmitted through the shock into the body of the car, and that's what you feel. You get boom, hit up and down and crashing over these bumps. That's the force going through the shock into the chassis of the car into your butt.
That's why I don't like my tow pig.
Too stiff.
It's horrible.
Yeah. So softening the shocks allows that to move much faster without changing your roll stiffness. And there's some bleed over. I mean, like I said, if you really crank up your compression, you're going to affect the roll stiffness because the car simply won't transfer as much because it doesn't have time. And the shock is going to resist some of that motion. So there's some bleed over, but it is the job of the spring to create the roll stiffness, and it's the job of the shock to manage the movements.
And I care about my roll stiffness versus my speed. How?
Yes, because they do different things. So the roll stiffness is going to largely impact your contact patch.
Okay.
So if you're on a perfectly smooth surface and you go into a corner and you've got your alignment set for a very specific amount of body roll, that body roll is a function of your roll stiffness.
Okay.
If you then change your roll stiffness, the body is going to roll more or less depending on your change. And now your contact patch isn't correct anymore because you've moved your suspension to a different part of its travel where the alignment is different.
Okay.
Which is also going to affect that other complicated stuff we talked about, like the oh my gosh,
roll centers.
Thank you, roll centers. Yes,
I'm paying attention, man.
My brain just leaked out of my ears.
I'm here for you.
Thank you.
I think I got right so far. I got a half.
No. You got plenty right.
Okay.
It's just the nuances. There's a lot of pseudo information floating around about how to set up a car, and some of it is kind of right, but kind of by accident. Like if you crank up your shocks in the back, it's probably going to make the car oversteer more, but not because it is changing the roll stiffness of the back.
Okay. So we've got to do a public service announcement.
Sure.
We do.
So yeah, we do. So I was told, and I've heard this many times, and I have no idea if it's true. Never take your adjustable shock all the way to the one end or all the way to the other.
Depends on the shock.
Okay.
There's a lot of depends.
Well, yeah, that's the problem, Vicki. That's why this is so
hard.
hard.
Especially as we're getting older. Oh wait, wrong subject.
No.
Sorry. It was funny. Come on.
But that actually brings up an excellent point. There is a whole lot of depends, and what that means is you got to test.
Right.
It's all theory until you test it and prove it.
I think we should have another episode on testing because that I can do.
Yeah. Oh man, testing is so big because it is all theory, and some things are relatively easy to test, like the tire temps or lap time. If it's faster, it's faster. But you still got to be careful because it's impossible to control a test to the degree that you would in a lab because racetracks are dynamic. The temperature changes, the number of heat cycles on your tires change. If you have something like a Super 200 tire, like an AO52, the first 2 heat cycles are the best, and after that they fall off a cliff.
Right.
So if you're testing with a brand new AO52 and that's got a certain level of grip, and it's going to create a certain amount of body roll as a result of that grip, it might be perfect. Everything might look awesome. And then 2 heat cycles later, same car, same track, same settings, suddenly your inside temps might look too hot because the tire simply isn't making as much grip as it used to. So it's not rolling over as hard as it used to. You didn't change anything, but the tire's falling off. The tire's changing its grip level, and that's affecting everything.
Yeah.
So here's actually a piece of advice that I'll give just sort of globally. Never set up your car to a bad tire unless you know you're going to always be driving on bad tires.
Oh, well, yeah.
He said tire, not driver.
Oh,
Because that's the other thing we have is that usually we're dealing with 3 or 4 drivers, sometimes more. And then it gets really complicated. Like who do we optimize for, and test for? Because I drive differently than Vicki, who drives differently than Jennifer, who drives differently than Alan, who drives differently than Jeremy, who drives like a crazy person. Not really, but felt like saying it to Jeremy because he never comes on anymore. So testing is hard for us.
A car that is not set up to be its peak perfect performance with a totally incredible fast driver is faster than a car that is set up that way but is facing the wrong direction because the second driver couldn't drive it.
Yeah, we tend to go kind of towards that way. So what we do is we try and get the cars comfortable for our least experienced drivers. And then the rest of us just deal with it.
Yeah, and usually what that means is a little bit more of an understeer bias. Would you agree?
Neutral understeer, yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because Vicky's not a fan of oversteer just yet, especially in a front-wheel drive car. So
it can feel awkward. It can feel awkward, and it could be dangerous too if you don't know how to deal with it, and you're getting in these situations where you have to deal with it all the time. That can be sketchy.
I can help you with this handling thing. Okay, so this is my contribution to the handling discussion. Because I don't know if you know this, but if you put a 40-pound chocolate chip cookie on top of a Honda Civic, it does not improve handling.
That's unfortunate.
You don't see that in many of the handling setup books, but I thought I'd give that to you, since you run a class on handling. But 40-pound chocolate chip cookie on top of a car, no bueno.
Well, that really is too bad. I guess that means you'll just have to eat it.
Exactly.
Since it's not doing any good on the car.
It wasn't doing any good on the car. It was good at spinning the car.
It was not I never thought about that when I designed the car. I did not take the weight factor into consideration.
You did.
You
took it into consideration. You didn't want the cookie to break or hit any of our friends' cars, so you made it very strong and sturdy. You just did not take into account that your steel reinforced cookie was going to weigh a lot.
Was steel reinforced?
Oh yeah, we made sure this thing wasn't going anywhere.
Maybe less delicious than I originally expected.
Yeah, very. Well, we had the real ones to eat too. This was like a 4-foot cookie on top of the car. It was
unless you're Jaws from James Bond.
Yeah.
He might like that cookie.
Yeah, he might.
So I read once that the job of a race car is to be as fast as possible for the duration of the competition, requiring as little skill as needed from the driver. And I thought that was an interesting way to think about it.
Our cars aren't doing their job then. That's all I'm saying. Because we've got the little skill locked up on our team, and they're just not getting it done.
It's kind of an interesting perspective, though, right? Because it's not something that you'd think about if you're going to tune your car. About, let's build this to require as little skill as possible. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because if it doesn't require much skill, then even a skilled driver will have less work to do, and will have an easier time, and will therefore be able to be less fatigued and make better choices, and generally have a better time during the race.
Wouldn't that lead you to a neutral car though, as opposed to,
maybe.
As
usual.
It depends.
Yeah, as usual.
It depends.
Is Russ Bentley here again?
So here's something to think about. Throughout the course of a race, cars change.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a neutral car, you might end up using more rear tire than you do front tire.
Okay, I can see that.
Because if you've got a neutral car, you're probably rotating it quite a bit, and having a blast and turning out some fast lap times. That might abuse the rear tires more than it does the front tires. So by the end of that race, you might no longer have a neutral car. You might have an oversteer-based car, biased car.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to set my cars up to be a little bit understeer biased. Not that I particularly enjoy understeer. I don't. But I have found that dynamically, from a driving standpoint, I can fix understeer. I can't fix oversteer. I can deal with oversteer, but I can't fix it. But if I have a car that has a mild understeer, I can transfer weight onto the front tires and get that sucker to rotate and fix that understeer problem with my driving. And then, if I've done that successfully, by the time I get to corner exit, now I've got this car with a ton of forward bite. It's going to let me put the power down really effectively. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. That's my particular preference. That's not to say that everybody's going to set up a car that way. That's just what works for me.
Well, it's also a matter of degree, right?
Of course, yeah. Oh, yeah. If you've got a snowplow for a race car, you're not going to have a good time. I don't care who you are.
It's true. You know what? I think anybody who can control and take control of the understeer car and turn it to their advantage should have a company that deals with car control.
They probably should.
And making people faster sideways.
They probably should do that.
They should do that. Wish we knew that guy. Sounds like a good guy.
If I meet him, I'll send him your way.
I think you already have. Okay.
And by the way, in case anybody didn't listen to the first episode about car control, the name Fast Sideways refers to what we were just talking about there, rotation. It's not about drifting, because drifting, of course, is not fast.
Nope. I can make people very unhappy with me when I start doing my figure skating for racing. GarageHeroesInTraining@gmail.com for all your letters. So yeah, sorry, not my thing, but that's okay. I respect it. It's just not my thing. So, Nick, I think Vicky's head's going to bust.
My head hurts.
I was just going to ask, have we numbed brains enough yet?
I think
what I'm going to have to do is go back and listen to this podcast several times and then actually look at a suspension.
Yes.
While I'm doing it.
You got to look up. I don't know if you have can provide links to images. Maybe we'll pick some really nice, pretty diagrams that we can of a McPherson strut and a multi-linked or something like that.
We can do that. Double wishbone.
Yeah.
I was going to say Vicky's basically her brain is understeering right now.
Yeah. So there's that, but I'm actively installing a suspension, and I'll be doing that on Wednesday.
In which car?
It is going to be a Honda Fit.
Okay.
We have it. It's this Honda Fit that just keeps giving. We can't get it off the lift. It keeps going up, gets stuck, comes back down, but anyway, we're actively putting the suspension in. So while I'm going to be listening to this podcast in my ear, I'm going to be installing this at the same time and kind of really thinking about what we're discussing right now.
Yeah. Well, my advice, and this is just a real general thing, both for you, Vicki, and for anybody listening who's going to be installing suspension. Pay close attention to the travel of the shocks.
Okay.
So if you take off whatever's on there now, whether it's OEM or something aftermarket, and hold it in your hand and hold it up next to your new one and look at the length of the shock shaft and look at the length of the body.
Okay.
And maybe we'll save this for another podcast, but consider how the lengths of those two pieces will play into what the limitations are for compression and rebound travel of the car. Because you don't ever want to be in a situation, if you can avoid it, where you're running out of travel in either direction. You want to be in that nice, happy medium zone.
I've been in a
Okay.
car where I bottomed out, so to speak. I don't know if that's the right racing term, but it wasn't
Yeah.
fun.
No, it's not fun, is it?
No,
Mm-mm.
no. On the list of yes or no, that's on the no side.
Yeah, bump stops are they're meant to be a fail-safe. They're not meant to be driven on,
Yeah. Yeah.
as you have figured out.
I know. I was like, okay, don't need that back disc anymore. I'll go get another one. It was
Oh,
fun.
that's easy. They can do that in an afternoon these days, I've heard.
I've heard. I don't want to experience it. I've got enough spare parts in my body at this point. So very well. I think, Nick, that may be enough for the first bite of this apple, but we've got a lot more apples, and we've got a big old orchard of stuff. I don't even think we touched. I don't know how many. What did we touch? Like one paragraph of a 6-page doc.
I think so. Yeah. We scratched the
Yeah.
surface on several different components,
We
but
did.
that's the difficulty here. Is you can't just look at one thing.
No.
If you look at one thing, you're very likely going to mess up all the other things.
I think the best thing that we touched, if you're going to look at one thing, is the testing, and we didn't even
Yeah.
talk about it.
Testing and tires.
Yeah.
Let me grab my mic again.
Tires.
That's a lot of tire.
Yeah,
Wow.
I think I'm definitely going to be this is just my entry level into this. So
Okay.
I have a feeling that as we keep revisiting this, I'll learn more.
We will.
Awesome.
We got more of these in our queue. Nick was kind enough to tolerate us for a little bit, and
it was rough, I got to tell you.
we've got more that we could potentially do. And if anybody has any questions or doesn't understand something, Nick may have an answer. We won't, but Nick may have an answer. I'm not promising, because we could have somebody out there who is a suspension engineer for some crazy race team and know way more about it than all of us combined. So
Yeah, let it be known that I am a generalist. I am not a suspension engineer. I know enough about components to know what to ask the experts to do.
Okay.
and you know what you like when you're sitting in the car.
Yes.
Exactly.
Correct.
See, we don't even know that. So we should work on that too. How do you figure
Yeah.
that out? All right. We've got more to do. The list gets getting longer.
Plenty to do. And let tire contact patch color your perspective as you think about handling and driving going forward.
I like it.
This one's going to take a while. I don't think 2 is going to do it, Nick.
Episode 13.
Episode part 12. We had a 12-part series before. This might beat it. We'll see.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, let's get some more people in who are smarter than I am.
Well, let's get to the point
Smarter
where
than me.
we can ask a good question before we start inviting the entire world in. So if you are a race engineer who wants to ask questions or answer questions, Garage Heroes in Training, or if you have a question, garageheroesintraining@gmail.com. But if you want to talk to Nick about being fast, learning how to control your car, go into one of his events, which we can't release yet, but we're working on it on the West Coast. Nick has many.
Plenty on the West Coast.
East Coast, we're still working on it. We're almost
East
there.
Coast has been a challenge, but we'll get there.
I got two possibilities. We'll talk about post podcast. But Nick, how do they find out where Fast Sideways would be?
You can find out about Fast Sideways at fastsideways.com. We're also on Instagram at Fast Sideways. You can email info@fastsideways.com. And we've even got like a little promo on YouTube.
You do. It was quite fun.
Although I don't know I'd have to link it.
We'll link it. And
Yeah.
we're probably going to have some links and some pictures on this episode notes. So we'll do that. And don't forget, because Nick is way too shy and doesn't want to shill as much as I do, sim coaching or consulting on your sim rig, Nick could be your man.
That's right. I've got 4 in the queue right now, building ground up from the PC to the frame to all the hardware components like the wheel and the pedals, etc. And it's a really, really awesome way to get faster even when you're not at the track. You can get faster in your pajamas on a Thursday night, and that's pretty cool. You can also drive any car in the world on any track in the world. It really is a pretty phenomenal thing once you get the hardware and the software set up correctly so that it's close enough to real life that you can actually gain some real muscle memory from it. And I'm even doing some car control training in the sim at this point as well. It's pretty awesome.
I will be. I was supposed to be assembling one this weekend, but house moving got in the way, and we'll be using it for my One Lap of America training because I'm going to many
excellent.
tracks that I don't know. So
Excellent.
So
Let's talk about that offline.
we can
Let
do
me know
that.
what you got.
We can do that. Oh, we will.
Okay.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it. We'll bother you again.
Thank you so much. Bother me
Thank
anytime.
you.
Part one of many.